A very, very warm welcome to you, Dr. Klingler-Vidra. As we begin today's fireside chat on the world of startups, for everyone to know here, we are joined by someone who knows this subject very, very closely, Dr. Robyn Klingler-Vidra, Associate Professor in Political Economy and Entrepreneurship at King's College London. She's also the Vice Dean for Global Engagement of the institution, and recently co-authored a book, Startup Capitalism, which I imagine is right here with her, on new approaches to innovation strategies in East Asia. And with us are some very senior editors, colleagues from the India Today group, from various brands that we have, and a new batch of students from the India Today Media Institute, one of the foremost institutes in this space in the country. And they will go on to become some of the sharpest journalists in Indian media. So thank you very much for being here with us. It's an absolute delight to have you with us. What we want to do in the time that we have with you here is to discuss the world of startups. A lot of the people here might have seen Shark Tank India, and I'll get you to talk about its origins as well. And we'll try and get a few questions from the audience, so please be ready. I will try and squeeze in a few questions. So let me begin by asking you to give us a sense of the Indian startup ecosystem that you might have managed to gather, and particularly from a comparison with countries like Japan, for example. How do you think India has done as far as startups are concerned, and do you see these startups contributing to a new wave of growth in the Indian economy?
Perfect. First, thanks very much for having me and for the question, and nice to meet everyone. Can I first go back to the Shark Tank India? If you watch the show all the time, could you put your hand up all the way?
Okay, that's a big sample.
If I've seen it a little bit, I've seen an episode, and then I ask my students to this. If you've never seen it and you're thinking to yourself, what is Shark Tank India? Then you would stretch down to the floor. No. Okay, no. There was a lot of this. Okay, so there's a lot of interest in startups, right? Obviously, this entrepreneurial culture and this celebration of startups. I think in India, and I should say that my expertise is on East Asia. I look at Japan and Korea, Taiwan, and China in comparison with the US and the UK. From what I can comment on, acknowledging my expertise on the growth and the sort of momentum in India, it's a tremendous positive news story, right? You have 120 approximately unicorns, growing amounts, although there's volatility year over year in terms of venture capital, corporate venture capital. But as you indicated with the Shark Tank India answer, I think that the 9 years almost exactly that it's been of Startup India as a concerted policy push to popularize, to make startup activity easier, right, to reduce the number of days that it takes to start a company, etc. From that perspective, there's obviously a lot that's been accomplished over the last 9-10 years in particular. You mentioned Japan maybe as a comparator. So in my work on what I call startup capitalism, which effectively says that we're interested in startups, and maybe there's this idea that startups are the great innovators, right? They drive our products, our lifestyle, our innovation forward. But there's another version where startups aren't the only mechanism. And what we reveal in Startup Capitalism is along the lines, Siddharth, as you mentioned, in the sort of Japan and Korea being great examples of this, is that startups can also be sort of resources or contributors to the wider economy in a different way. So what we found in Korea, one of our interviewees mentioned specifically that startups help to inject innovative DNA into the chaebol, into Samsung, into LG. And so a rise in startup activity can have benefit for startups and their abilities to raise money and offer improved products and services, to become unicorns. But also, startups can boost the wider economy, right? They can inject that innovative DNA into the large firms, which the sort of Japanese approach and also Korean in a similar way is very good at.
What about China? Because while we are sitting here in India, we end up looking at the Chinese economy, the kind of success that it has. It's a behemoth in manufacturing. Some of the new economy areas, particularly electric vehicles, for example, just to cite one, China clearly leads that. Yet it has done 360-degree integration from rare earths to the basic mining material to the final product. China seems to have done it all. What are the lessons that India can learn from the Chinese way of doing things?
I think the strength of the Chinese approach, and again, thinking about startups and where are we driving innovation, is the role of government as agenda setter, right? As sort of motivating or giving a focus, offering a sort of carrot. And the great example here is Made in China 2025, right? Which identifies some of the technologies that you mentioned, and then allocates capital, tax incentives, but really puts on the agenda, these are the places where if you're looking to be an entrepreneur, if you're looking to really make a difference, and if you're going to have the support of the state, this is where you want to be operating. And so for me, part of the lessons from China is around that agenda setting power. But the other one, there's a scholar / actually venture capitalist whose work I like a huge amount. His name's Kai-Fu Lee. He was the head of Google China for years, and now he's a venture capitalist in Beijing. And he speaks about China as having what he calls gladiatorial entrepreneurs. And so he says there's extreme competition when you're starting up. Once you sort of gain scale and you're growing, then there's that ability to become, ByteDance or Alibaba or something, Tencent, Huawei. But when starting up and when fighting for your position, there's such intense competition that this is what makes the Chinese ecosystem so incredibly fast, right? In comparison, some of the analysis speaks about a more pedestrian place elsewhere. I don't know, I like the sort of indication. So if you can stay with me, if I can ask you, have you heard of 996? It's like this.
Yeah.
No. Have you heard of 007? Other than James Bond, not James Bond, yeah? Okay. So 996 is the Chinese sort of shorthand for startup tech work culture. And it means that you work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week.
Wow.
So that pace, which if you extend the Kai-Fu Lee idea, it comes from the fact that
we have a celebrated Indian software founder, Mr. Narayan Murthy, who sparked an absolute controversy on working hours. But 996, so remember, if you want to do that, the Chinese way is to work from 9 to 9.
This is the old one.
This is the old one,
so
okay.
Now it's not 996. Now it's the 007 that I asked you about, which you can imagine. It's 24/7. I don't know if it's a lesson. It's obviously for a lot of different reasons. It's not. But I think that what I argue in my research, looking over lots of interviews and looking at policies and government media statements over a 50-year time period, is what China does well is that sort of goal setting, a system that encourages or requires competition because of the scale and the potential, which I think corresponds well in some ways to the Indian context. But that working ethic thing is certainly part of the story as well.
That brings me to another point, and this is the leadership that China is showing to the world in the new economy areas. And there's a lot of commentary about how the Western world, Europe particularly, and the US is now falling behind China in these new growth areas. Is it because of, for example, this work culture, 007 culture? I didn't know about it. Thank you for telling us about it. Is it because the Chinese state is actively embedded in many of these new growth areas behind what appear to be private sector firms? What is the difference, and why, if at all you agree, that the West seems to be falling behind in some areas behind China?
I think that it's undeniable the gap that's been closed across those technologies named in particular in the Made in China 2025. Undeniable that China's moved up amongst the top and in some cases at the absolute frontier. For me, one of the takeaways is that in these critical technologies, in these crucial areas that the state has identified, again, thinking about what's the point of startups, it's a whole of system approach, and it's an ability to marshal, let's say, resources across large lead firms in partnership with SMEs and startups throughout, as you mentioned, that sort of vertical across the supply chain in a very purposeful way. And I think that's certainly a China story. I would say that it's not only China. Right? One of the issues that sort of always is the subtext maybe of looking to learn from the Chinese system is, okay, but we're a democracy, right? Can we copy that? Can we learn from that, or do we want to? The Japanese and Korean model of also thinking about a whole of system approach, working with the chaebol, with the keiretsu, working with the large firms, because the nature of international competition in those really capital-intensive, huge infrastructure requirements, huge energy needs, those technologies of today require a national effort. Devolving it, thinking that that disruptive startup from the outside could compete on this global scale where other countries are working sort of hand in hand with large businesses. And then we haven't even spoken about sort of President Trump and the stakes taken in Intel and NVIDIA, right? So this sort of whole of systems approach is not something that it's only China that's done well, but certainly China's done it extraordinarily well.
This is a very important point that you make, because many of us here in this discussion would be wondering that just 24 hours ago, one of the key pieces of news that emerged in India was a startup, a unicorn by the way, in the trucking space, which has decided to leave Bengaluru on account of infrastructure issues. And the question that I have for you, you spoke about capital, you spoke about state intent and policy in fostering entrepreneurship in the startup arena. What about infrastructure? Because it's clear to me all the four countries, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, it's certainly given that the civic infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and the quality of life is at a certain level. You don't need to be worrying about whether you will get to work in time. You don't worry whether you will have electricity in the office or at the place where you live. Those are given. But in India, those are still issues that most startup founders, including this most recent example, grapple with. Is that therefore a key differentiator in the success?
I think that's absolutely part of the story. And if I think about, so in the work that we did on Startup Capitalism, we look at specific examples of Alibaba, of Taobao, of the sort of maker economy and sort of e-commerce players, and very purposeful government investments into, in partnership with private firms, but into the local logistics infrastructure that's needed, right? And really mapping out what's needed end to end to make the firms here compete and to really scale. And I think that scale of ambition and then following it through is essential. Not sort of, for 3-4 years or for one cycle having a moderate level of investment. It's taking reasonably big bets, looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years into the future and saying what infrastructure can we put in place to enable that now. Not in the Chinese case, but in Korea, for example, looking at the infrastructure that was backed and set on the agenda from the government, but then in partnership with large firms for 5G years ago, thinking that, well, if we're going to have innovation in terms of, gaming that Korea became, a world leader in, we need to have a certain speed of internet, right? So thinking, what are the derivative capabilities that come from investments in these core infrastructures?
It's interesting you brought up digital infrastructure, because while I'd asked you about physical infrastructure, which is still an issue in some parts of the country, here. Digital infrastructure is where I would argue that India's startup revolution has actually been embedded upon. And it was the 5G networks, it was cheap data, it was, electronic KYC, and faceless customer acquisition, and so many other innovations. The entire India stack, really, the digital stack, which has brought about so many digital startups. Is there a comparable example in your research that you have come across of a country being able to leapfrog from average physical infrastructure to having absolutely a world-class digital infrastructure backbone? Does India, according to you, set an example in this space?
India, China, I would put there. I would also have Korea. In terms of not digital infrastructure per se, but in terms of a sort of leapfrog, let's say, to capabilities and frontier technologies, France has had a huge boost towards the frontier as well with Mistral and its sort of AI capabilities. But I think that China and India would stand out as huge scale leap in terms of what's possible in a digital economy.
I want to ask you, who do you think will win the AI race?
Oh, that's such a tough question. So I don't think the AI race has a singular winner or point. I mean, taking, for instance, the DeepSeek moment as an example, this obviously was a watershed, and there's more iterations that are released all the time, right? I think that a lot of the winners will be those, in the gold rush, the people that really made money weren't the ones that found gold. It was the companies that were selling pickaxes and shovels. And I think that AI has similar sort of narratives or characteristics to it, and I think there's a lot of applications or sort of commercial bends to it, and that pushed an iteration of different models might bifurcate from what I see. Maybe we were in this thinking that the largest large language model and then all of the needs that go with that will be the winner. And we see these huge amounts of money that are raised by AI firms. But then recently there's more and more talk about those smaller and sleeker models and their ability to operate without the huge, say, energy needs, and maybe the potential for winners that come from that efficiency, maybe like a DeepSeek moment versus an OpenAI, for instance.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good point that you make, because the discourse, and we've been discussing internally for our upcoming event on AI, that perhaps the question that we should be asking is about whether SLMs, smaller language models, will work for India given its diverse population and needs. And you added a new word to that, according to me, replacing the large with a lean language model. So we won't call it a large language model. Before we go across, and please do raise your hands if you have a question, I want to also take a point on the political economy, because I don't know how many of you do go and check out Robyn's profile, but she's also an expert on political economy. Given what's happening in the world of trade and what President Trump has unleashed, do you see the last 3 decades of how global trade organized itself, supply chains, and obviously there have been a few winners and many losers? I think part of the sentiment that we see in the United States that is represented by President Trump is the fact that the United States economy has lost out on certain kind of job creation within the domestic economy. Wealth creation continues. What kind of new trade order do you see evolving out of the current turmoil?
That's a great question. There's obviously, well, as a political economist, looking further back, I would say that the nature of the global value chains and those crucial leads in different ways has been politically or geopolitically motivated or supported. And my overall thesis would be that you'll see a persistence in that friend-shoring, reshoring, working with allies in a more explicit way, and more of a bifurcation away from the great power sort of struggle or war, if we're using that language, which feels quite emotive. The tariffs, because they're moving so quickly, right? They're it feels like, or maybe my hope as a political economist is that the tariffs are used for a short-term sort of negotiation tool or power or tactic, but that longer term there will be a return to the mean. So I would continue to see allies working with allies. I would think that there's some of this sort of posturing or use of tariffs, but in a way that ultimately, in sort of a few years from now, will go back in many ways to the way it was. But as you say, maybe in the interim, changing slightly the terms of trade and bringing especially manufacturing or smart manufacturing more back to the US. I mean, just quickly to say that, as I mentioned, I look at East Asia, and it's incredible to look at the CHIPS Act and how the US government was investing in Samsung and TSMC, for instance, $6 billion each, to build and grow facilities, manufacturing in the US, in Arizona and Texas. And then in the Trump administration, there's a reversal in terms of who's paying, and significantly, right? So my family lives now in Arizona. They like nicer weather than I do in London. And the TSMC plant is a $165 billion plant where there's been a significant investment from TSMC into bringing capabilities into the US. And so that tightens or reinforces geopolitical alliances in my view, but maybe it changes a bit the terms of trade in some ways.
Okay. In the time that we have left, I just want to bring in one question. Are there any hands here? Okay. I see a hand there, and was there one more? Okay, we'll try and get a mic, but very quickly on the semiconductor space, India's invested considerable sums of money in the recent past and looks at semiconductors now from a more of a strategic imperative, given national security concerns. Is it possible for a country and the nature of our economy to make a serious dent in the semiconductor space, because you've tracked it, and I saw you had written a piece also about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is where the whole of systems approach is essential. This is also maybe in a slightly more negative frame. This is still one of the areas where the catch-up or the closing to the frontier in the Chinese context isn't as great as in other technologies, right? So you have SMIC or SMIC that and Huawei that are producing close to the world frontier, but always still behind. So the latest that I saw was sort of mass production at 7 nanometers, for instance. And that's with the better part of 2 decades and billions of pounds invested. From that view, chips are a difficult place to leapfrog or to catch up. But I would also say that when I started writing about the gap and the capabilities around semiconductors globally, it wasn't that China was on the heels, right? The idea of Moore's law and this sort of perpetuity of the difference would continue, and that's closed. And so I think chips are the ultimate critical technology of our current era. And to not have autonomy over chips. And also, I mean, chips are just in everything that we do and everything that we use. So pushing towards that technological frontier of, say, the 2 nanometer and the absolute cutting edge is one thing. But I think something that a lot of the sort of push or advance, again, in the Chinese context, is to say, well, let's be really good at producing the chips that go into so much of what we use today, not only that frontier. And so I would see it as a longer-term infrastructure play and investment to say, what are all of the chips that our day-to-day life depends on? How do we ensure a supply? And always pushing towards that frontier, but also thinking about the wider spectrum.
20 years ago, if I would have asked this question to someone, people would have said, no, you don't need to bother about it. The world is a different world. It's a globalized world. You can buy the best from the world. But clearly thinking has changed. So even if globalization doesn't end like on one particular day, it's changing in its format. So I think we have time for 2 quick questions. I saw a hand there. I'll come to you first. Introduce yourself and keep your question short.
So, good evening. My name is Neha Soni, and I'm from Mumbai, Maharashtra. So, my question to you is that in the history we have witnesses, like due to the high dollar price, we have witnesses the de-dollarization. And when it coming to the recent world, where the capital race is way ahead of the time, as well as the high inflation rate and the coming up as a new currency like a BRICS currency, what as an economist do you believe like impact is going, like the BRICS currency and the Asia's recent development is going to impact on the Western economy with respect to the de-dollarization? Is it
Okay.
possible in the recent days?
Okay, so is de-dollarization likely? And do you think the BRICS can emerge as a serious challenger? There is no BRICS currency, clearly, that's been said repeatedly, but can the BRICS bloc, an expanded BRICS bloc, change the current order of things as far as the global economy is concerned?
Great question, Neha. Thanks for that. If I understand, or if we think about de-dollarization as reducing the reliance on the dollar as the reserve currency, and thinking about a basket of currencies that are in wider use, the BRICS efforts, and also, I mean, in the Chinese push for years now of the internationalization of the RMB and the yuan is increasingly well entrenched. I mean, I sit in England, where the sterling continues to be an important global currency as well. As an economist, I think having a basket of currencies that are the locus of global activities means the potential for greater stability, which I like. The idea of over-reliance on a single one, and then, as we mentioned, sort of interest rates and inflation rather. The problem with that is that when you have, say, inflation at the core, in this case in the US with the dollar, that then flows, that transmits across the world. So I think from that sense, having more of a distributed mix is beneficial from a stability perspective.
Fair point there. There was a question right here. Somebody had raised here. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Prakriti Sharma. It's very nice to meet you. But my question is, according to you, what is the biggest challenge for journalism that today we are facing, like in a globalized world?
Great question, Prakriti. What's the biggest challenge? So I suppose the elephant in the room is the potential use of Gen AI and content being sort of easily produced and disseminated, if that's the risk. I think there's no greater time for the human voice and the critical thinking that comes with good, high-quality journalism. I think that increasingly we can tell when something has been written, by AI, right? And increasingly the studies in academia show that when we sense it, we don't like it. Right? So that ability to cut through, the ability to have that original thought, to flip a story and look at it from a multitude of perspectives, I think there's an increasing premium on that, and I see that as something that we need. I mean, sort of related, I would say that with our students, one's ability to do research is more important than ever in a similar way. Once you produce knowledge, so as journalism students, you've written the article, you know what you didn't include, you know the perspective you didn't take, you know the people that didn't have a voice there. And I think with our students being involved in that, asking the research question or thinking, what's the story I'm writing, means that then when you're a sort of consumer of other people's knowledge, you're much more critically engaged, right? You're thinking about how did this come to be and what's missing here. So I think the case for like journalism and the skills that it comprises is persistently important.
I want to follow that up. Will it be that you wouldn't need to study as hard as you did in a world of AI and just sort of focus on having skills of generating or writing the correct prompt? I mean, would a PhD hold lesser value in the world of AI?
It's such a good question. So I can speak to the way that we think about it at King's Business School. So it's a tool like anything else, right? Gen AI is a tool, just as we might have seen pushback on the use of the internet to do your essays when it came to be, and then the use of computers. Right? There was even the Luddite movement against the use of elevators or lifts because it meant that you're taking away jobs and things. So I think it's a tool like anything else. Does it make it easier? If it's a good tool, it should. But the way that we think about teaching and learning in terms of the use of Gen AI is to be thoughtful and reflective, and so to use multiple. So, you're using Gemini, you're using Copilot, you're using ChatGPT, etc. Together, working on your prompt engineering. It's a skill, fine. But then always pushing to, well, what are the sources that are sitting behind this? What are the differences that I see across? What's my voice in coming, through in what's been written? I think there's questions and there's things that we grapple with our students about when and how across a project do you use the tools, right? Do you use it as an idea generation sort of sparring partner? Do you use it to write, which is what you sort of insinuated? Do you use it as an editor at the end? And how does your use across those different points change? And how do you reflect and think critically about the product across each of those?
So if a student were to use AI for in any activity that is part of his course, would he be cheating?
No, and we encourage to some extent our students to use it, because for us not to isn't fair to the students, right? The reality of the world is that it's a tool, and we can't pretend, and we don't want to pretend that it's not there. But the question is, how well do you use it, right? If you use it to do, as you said, a lazy prompt to write a generic essay on economics and the impact of de-dollarization, but it doesn't refer to any of the citations, any of the references that you covered in the module, any of the core debates that you've looked at. If it's really sort of generic, high level, it's obvious that you didn't use it well, right? If instead you've used it, I mean, we have a lot of students who speak a multitude of languages at King's, for example, right? If you're using it to help proofread, fantastic, right? But make sure that it's your voice, your research that's driving it. So we're interested in the ways in which, and we often will ask our students to declare, how have you used it, in which ways, in which capacities? And then as a tutor, so I supervise master's dissertations across the summer. And so I work with the students to say, okay, how has it helped this stage of the process? How has it changed the output of what you have? Are you happy with that? How do you go back and how you change it? So it's all out in the open.
Absolutely, and this is perhaps going to be one of the biggest things that journalism, teachers of journalism, and you as a teacher of business education alongside so many other subjects, we'll all have to grapple with AI and how it changes what you do. Robyn, thank you very much for your time with us today.
Very much, Siddharth. Thank you.